and I'm thankful for that. Seems to be very happy. But she always says, tell everybody I miss them, and I know she does. We return tonight to the valley of Elah with this ongoing battle between the children of Israel and the Philistines. A challenge has been made, which would have been customary at that particular time in history. A challenge by one particular fighter to come out and face off against another fighter from the opposite camp. And whoever wins, well, wins the battle. If Goliath's challenge is, if I can beat your man, then you all will be subservient to the Philistines. And if your man can beat me, which Goliath has the attitude that that's impossible, you'll never find such a man, then we'll be your servants. Now, no one wants to go out and fight Goliath, and understandably so. He's well over 9 feet tall. The Philistines are great warriors. They are people who have a ready arsenal, always ready to defend themselves and to create havoc wherever they go. The Israelites are not nearly well prepared in that sense like unto the Philistines. So King Saul on down they all are trembling. King Saul and all of his men are trembling at the thought of facing these Philistines. Now, there is this valley of Elah, and that's where the battle is supposed to take place. And on each side, mountains, and you've got the two opposing forces on each side. Now, David, though he has already been declared a future king, Samuel has already said it, and God's given his approval. This is the one God chose. It's going to be David. It won't be Jonathan. It won't be any of the descendants of Saul. It's going to be David. And so David, in his humility, did what after he was anointed? He went right back to tend his sheep, right? It was not time for him to take the reins of leadership just yet. But his father trusted in him and depended upon him. And his father sent him down to the place of battle to see what's going on. Take your brother some food and give me a report. See how things are going. And you remember that David was rather excited by all that was going on. Now, David, at this point in his life, is one who is young, but he is one who prays. He is one who loves God and he loves righteousness. And his brothers, not nearly evidently as faithful to God as is he, they were all overlooked, weren't they? Though to the physical eye it would seem that Eliab, the oldest, probably was the one in man's eyes fit to be a king. None of the brothers were chosen. And when Samuel asked, is there any more? Well, there's one, the one out there keeping the sheep. And it seems that Jesse's saying, you don't want him. He couldn't be the king. Well, let's get him in here. And God says, that's the one. And so out on this battlefield, David is just amazed why anybody would be shaken. He's been taught that you trust in God. He's been taught that God will deliver you. And he says, I had to fight a lion, I had to fight a bear. He said, I whipped the lion and the bear. He said, I could whip that Philistine. Now, his older brother got upset with him, didn't he? And there's a point to be made here because that older brother turns against David. What are you here? I mean, why are you here? What do you want to do? You just trying to show out? What's the purpose of you being here? And David just, well, is there not a cause? Are we not going to stand for God or not? And it's interesting that David turns his attention away from his brother. Now, the devil has a way of saying to brethren, you just fight and feud among yourselves, right? Turn on each other. But thankfully for men like David, they can see clearly who the enemy really is. And David just turned his attention away from his older brother, and he turns his attention back to where it ought to be, on the real enemy, which is whom? Goliath and the Philistine army. And so he goes to King Saul. Well, King Saul, he's not too sure really about David doing this, but nobody else wants to do it. Who should have done it? King Saul should have done it, right? I mean, he stood head and shoulders above everybody else. He's the leader of the... But God's left. God left him. And Samuel's left him. And therefore Saul has made a decision, and Saul's on his own. And that's why he is fearful. You see, if you fear God, you don't have to fear anything else. But if you don't fear God, you fear everything else. That's just how it is. And so he's lost his fear and his trust and his adoration for God. He started off wonderfully well, very humble, but no more. And he knows that God's not with him. And then here he puts all this armament, and all this battle gear on David, and David says, "I haven't earned this; it doesn't fit me." And David decides that he will go on his own, because David, unlike all the rest in the camp, he's going in the fear of Almighty God. Now, this is a great chapter that teaches us how to face the giants in our own lives. And particularly, David is one of those character studies that we like to relate to our youth, don't we? Very early in life, I heard the story of David. And I think the reason that was one of those early narratives that I was told was because David was a man of great courage. David was a godly young man. And so therefore, if you want a hero in youth or at any other time in life, you look to this man, David. Now, verse 38 tells the story about Saul arming David with his armor and putting on his helmet upon his head and armed with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, but he says, "I haven't proved it." All right? And David put off all that. He just simply took his staff in his hand, and he went down and chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook. We sing about this even as children, don't we? Put them in his shepherd's bag, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Now, would David have probably been an expert at using this sling? No doubt he was. So he'd used this before. And so it is in verse 41 of chapter 17 that the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. Now, all of a sudden, Goliath doesn't know whether to stand appalled or to laugh, right? He's thinking with worldly wisdom, right? Who is this? Who is this that's coming out? He says something like, "Am I a dog?" That's exactly who you are, Goliath. That is exactly who you are. And David is going to show all of Israel and the entire Philistine army today what you really are, and how that God will cut you down to size. So the Philistine, verse 42, looked about, saw David, and the text says he disdained him. He disdained David. He despised him because, for one thing, it was almost, Goliath felt like that he was being mocked. Right? Yes. Why would you send somebody like this out here? And so he looked upon him. He's just a young person. There's that word ruddy again, fair countenance. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David. In other words, let me get a closer look at you, boy, right? Let me get a closer look at you. Let me see if I can really figure this out. And so the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give your flesh to the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field." Now, here's one of the greatest statements of faith that's recorded in the entire Old Testament, maybe the whole Bible. David said, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast" what? Defied. Now, I really think Goliath is a good representation of the world out there that stands in opposition to everything that's good and right. And this particular passage teaches us that we do not have to shrivel up in fear, but rather we can stand up against it. And so he says, "Here's what I'm going to do to you." David said, "No, I'm coming to you in the name of the God you have defied." How long has it been since we looked at others and made this kind of statement? "I am tired of the way you defy my God." Right? I mean, all around us today there are people who are doing nothing more than defying our God. And God says, all you have to do is come in my name and bear my message, and I'll take care of you. And so David says, "I'm coming in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, and this day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand. I'll smite you." And he says, "I'll take your head from you." He said, I'm going to cut your head off. "And I'll give the carcasses of the hosts of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth." and all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. And so this is a remarkable young man. If you ever want to question what God saw in David, just go here to 1 Samuel 17. Is this a man after God's own heart? He knows God. Now we sometimes talk about David and the mistakes that he made in life, the very real sins that would eventually cause him to, I don't know, he would eventually be brought down in some extent. He'd have to pay a heavy price. The consequences of his sins were tremendous. But yet, when I read the book of Psalms, for example, I know that there are penitential psalms in there, and there are psalms of praise, and there are psalms of devotion, and there are psalms of dependence upon God. I noticed this about David, and this is what appeals to me, and I'm sure it does to you. Though he had great reverence for God, he could speak to God as if God was right across the table from him. He knew Him that well. And finally, even after he sinned, that great sin with Bathsheba, and we'll look at that sometime later, but when he was brought to his senses by Nathan, you see how he pours out his heart. Against thee and thee only have I sinned. So there's great confidence here. Now all this assembly shall know, verse 47, that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear. For notice this, the battle is whom? It belongs to who? The Lord. The battle's the Lord. The Lord's. He will give you into our hands. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. He put his hand in his bag, took thence a stone. He slang it, smote the Philistine in his forehead, and the stone sunk into his forehead, and he was dead, wasn't he? He fell to the earth. And so David prevailed, and he took Goliath's sword and cut off the head of Goliath, right? And so what happened? Well, the Philistines became subservient. No, they just ran. They didn't bow down before David. They just ran. And amazing what one person showing confidence in God will be able to do. Now that this has happened, who's ready to fight? The Israelites, right? Because of what they've seen David do, now they are ready to fight. And so the men of Israel, Judah rose, shouted, pursued the Philistines, and they did so until the gates of Ekron. It was just a complete defeat. Now Saul saw David go forth against the Philistines and said unto Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner says, I don't know. Now all I can picture right now is Saul and Abner standing there, and their mouths, have fallen. Their mouth, the bottom of the mouth has fallen down to the ground. Right? What have we just witnessed? This is very serious, but there's somewhat something comical you can see here. Here is David, young David has slain this Philistine. He's confident. He's happy because of what he's done. He's done this in the name of the Lord. And there's David and Abner, Saul and Abner went, what has gone on here? This is truly amazing. And the king said, I want to know who this is. I want to know whose son he is. And when Saul finds out that David belongs to Jesse the Bethlehemite, what does he say? He sends word to Jesse, you let him come stay with me. All right? Now, you let him come stay with me. Now, all that David knew up to this point, all Saul knew about David up to this point is he can do what? Play the harp well, right? Yet that same harpist is also a mighty warrior in his mind. And so according to chapter 18 in the opening verses, David is brought into the king's household. But as chapter 18 opens, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was left-handed. Okay. Were the left-handed ones? Okay. And he didn't miss. Think if he was right-handed, he'd still hit him? You think if he was right-handed, he'd still... I think he probably would, but all right. He did. But that's an interesting point. Thank you, Jude. Yeah. Well, it came from Judges, didn't it? Yeah. I could see that. They could run out there too, but that one did it, didn't it? But what if you missed on the first time too, you know? So he took 5. But he had confidence in the first one, didn't he? All right. In God, yes, that's right. Well, chapter 18 opens with one of the most beautiful friendships that you can read about in the Bible. People are really, really, I don't know, they're really having to look hard to try to destroy the beautiful relationship here between David and Jonathan. You know, a lot of people out there would like to have the Bible, would like to force the Bible to agree with their lifestyle. There are some that have tried to make this relationship unnatural or abnormal. It was not. It's just a beautiful, beautiful friendship. All right? And so there are people who will reject the Bible because they don't like what's in it. And there are those who will say, well, I like the Bible fine, but try to force it to fit their lifestyles. I'd rather see somebody like the first person who just says, okay, I don't want to believe the Bible. This is what it says. I reject it. Then somebody try to force it to say something it doesn't say. David and Jonathan had a beautiful relationship. Saul is the father of Jonathan, but the text here says that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. You ever had a friend like that? If you don't, you ought to have a friend like that. For sure, a husband and wife ought to feel that way toward one another, right? As far as friendship goes, our souls are knit to one another. But beyond that, what about that person that you know is such a friend? You can tell that person anything, and you know that if it's confidential, it stays with that person, right? David and Jonathan had that kind of friendship. Best of friends. And looked out for one another, right? You're going to find that Saul is going to become so desperate that after a while, he'll just make it clear, I want David dead. He doesn't start out that way. He tries to do some things behind the scenes. You know, he's even going to try to appease David if he can, and he's going to do some things behind the scenes where it doesn't look so blatant, but eventually he'll make it clear to Jonathan and everybody else, I want him dead. All right? Yes, I do. Yes, he was. He was mentally disturbed, but it was directly affected because of his rejection of God, I believe. So here is Saul who took David that day, the text says, and would let him go no more to his house. And Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Didn't Paul the Apostle say something like this? My heart's desire and prayer for Israel is they might be saved. Didn't even indicate he'd give up his own soul if that would somehow save all of them. That is tremendous love, isn't it? And here is David who is loved by Jonathan. And Jonathan already understands something. And what he understands is this. I'm not to be king. David's going to be king. That's already been revealed to him. He knows this. Some way. He knows it. David is going to be the king, and so Jonathan takes off his royal garments, and what did he do? He gave them to David. And he likewise submitted himself to David. You're going to be the king. Now, this shows Jonathan's heart, and it also shows his attitude with regard to respect for God's authority, doesn't it? You know, he didn't say, hey, I'll destroy this man that thinks he's going to get the throne. I mean, down through history, what has happened where you have monarchies, you have people vying for that throne, right? Yes, the eldest by right says it's his, and no one is to at all do anything that might upset that. And so people have fought and died trying to obtain an earthly throne. Jonathan says, my heart's with David. David is the one who is to be king. Now, David has been brought in to serve the king. Now, King Saul, needs David for more important purposes now than just playing the harp, doesn't he? He needs this expert warrior. At least that's how he appears in Saul's mind. And he sets him over the men of war in verse 5. Now, things are about to change. What did Saul see in David at first? Well, he was someone who soothed his spirits when he played the harp. Then he was somebody who came to his rescue there in the battle of Elah with the Philistines. All right? And so, hey, I need to do something for this person. Now, down through history, there have been those who, if you do something on my behalf, then I want to do something for you. Scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, but you're still under me. All right? Pharaoh owed so much to Joseph, right? But he still didn't he didn't become subservient to Joseph, did he? Joseph became number two. Number two, all right? So you may even number two, but you're not going to be number one. I'm number one. All this presidential politics is interesting. It takes me back. You remember 1980? That something remarkable was going to happen there back as Governor Reagan was about to win the nomination. And those of you who are old enough to remember this, and I'm old enough to remember it, you remember that there was this push at the last minute for former President Ford to join the ticket with Reagan. It would have been unprecedented. A former president would have become the vice president. And Governor Reagan evidently wondered, well, would this work? Maybe it'll work. If, number one, what will help us win the election? Would this Reagan-Ford ticket help us defeat the incumbents? Maybe that's what we ought to do. And so over the course of this convention, that talk was what was the headlines in the news. Will it be former President Ford? Will he now, for the first time in history, we have a vice president who's a former president? And so as they thought about this, President Ford started writing out things that he wanted, and it started appearing like it was going to be maybe a co-presidency. And President Ford was like, well, if I'm going to do this, then I want it to be a little different from anything. But will I have specific areas of policy that'll be mine? Will part of this, and then this will be Mr. Reagan's job. This will be my job, and it goes back and forth, and finally gets to the point where Governor Reagan says, this isn't going to work. Right? And President Ford said, no, it's not going to work. And President Ford pledged his support, but they knew it wasn't going to work. Why? Because on that occasion, Governor Reagan was running for president. And he wasn't going to share it with anybody, right? Yeah. Well, I told my brother that. That's right, yeah. And he didn't like that. He brought up that Pepsi bottle I've told you about before. I was the oldest in my family, and my mother would get these Pepsis because they were cheaper, not because that's what we wanted, but we took what she'd get. 69 cents for a 2-liter bottle. And so, on the side of Pepsi, it says Big Boss. And there's my younger brother, 6 years younger than I, and just look at him, and I said, you see that right there? That's me, right? Don't forget it. Don't forget it. I teased Sister Elkins one day. Sister Elkins here tonight? She's probably not here tonight. I'm going to tell it anyway. I'll tell her if she's here. But Sister Elkins always is, she likes to sign our cards, Prince, Princess. Don't we appreciate that? But I teased her one day, I said, if we're all prince and princesses, that makes you the queen. And she said, and don't you forget it. I said, I'm not. But we're talking about King Saul. I mean, King Saul isn't, he becomes paranoid then, doesn't he? Over David, because of the fact that while he rejoiced in what David had done for him, here's pride coming into play. It came to pass as they came back from war, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul. And notice the women answered one another as they played on their instruments, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David 10,000s. Oh. Who hears this? Saul hears this. Oh, what if it had been the other way around? David has killed thousands, and Saul 10,000. That's fine. But I've only killed my thousands. David, 10,000s? Oh, they like him more than they like me. They're praising him more than they praise me. Now what happens when... Has Saul really got anything to worry about from David? No, David did not seek out the position that will be his. God chose him for it. And it's his envy that came into play. But now let me say this about David. Didn't David come to his position the right way? Could David be a servant of the Most High God when he's out there in the shepherds, with the sheep and the flock and being a shepherd? Absolutely, he was. And if that's where God wanted him to stay, he would have stayed. All right? We got to know our boundaries, don't we? We've got to know, here's the place God has put me. If he wants to take me somewhere else, if he wants me to increase over more, have more authority over something, or expand what I now have, then that's up to him. And you graciously take that as he provides it. On the other hand, what is Saul? Saul is grasping, isn't he? This is mine. You don't take this from me. That's right. Now I'll tell you, because I know preachers. I'm a preacher, I know preachers. I have been in situations before where a congregation had a preacher for many, many years, and the preacher says, you know, I'm getting a certain age, and it's time for me to step aside, and agreement's worked out. The elders say, we love you, appreciate everything you've done for us, we'll still support you, stay here among us, we'll bring in a new man. Okay, that's wonderful. New man comes on into work, tries to give his best, does his job, but preacher's like, well, now, wait a minute. That there was my pulpit, you know. People are now flocking over to him now. He's the one they tell a good sermon on Sunday, right? Ooh, you have to guard that. I'll tell you, I went down to Fayette, Alabama in 1997 when I left Knight Arnold as associate preacher to work with the Fayette Church. And Brother Don McWhorter came to me one day and he said, I want to tell you something, Barry. He says, I'm here for you anytime you need me. Other than that, I'll be out of your way. And he meant that. There were times when I went to Brother McWhorter and said, Brother McWhorter, I need you. He said, what do you need? He said, you let me know. I'll help you out any way I can. But he never, ever, quote, got in my way. He supported me completely. That's the way it's supposed to be, isn't it? You see, my presence there didn't take anything away from Brother Don. He was still a giant to me. He was still a great preacher to me and to all those there. He just stepped into a different role. Well, King Saul, you know, he doesn't want anybody taking this from him. And he perceives that he is not going to be the king much longer, but rather David will be the king. The text says in verse 8, here he comes unglued. Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. Now, you know how the New Testament, Paul wrote about how, you know, guard that bitterness, because that bitterness can turn into anger and wrath and malice and all that, just like a volcano down inside getting ready to erupt, right? And that's what's going on there with Saul. He's already got mental issues brought on by his rejection of God. He's not seeing clear any longer. He's very fearful, he's very paranoid, and he's very hateful. He said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but what? The kingdom. If I don't do something about this, he says, he'll have the kingdom. Now look at this text right here, verse 9. This is sinful. Saul eyed David from that day forward. He envied him, didn't he? He eyed him. He watched him, right? Oh. Ooh, that's a terrible combination, isn't it? So from now on, he's eyeing David. You ever heard the phrase, you better watch your back? David better watch his back, right? Now, the good thing is have you ever heard it said, he or she is watching your back in a good way? They're looking out for you, right? They got your back. That's it. They got your back. So when somebody is out to get you, you know, better have somebody that's got your back. Now, who was that? Jonathan. Oh, Jonathan's a wonderful friend. Now, the problem is when you get people that are so paranoid and filled with envy, they don't know who to trust anymore. And so Saul just starts talking, you know, just to everybody. And he doesn't understand that not all these people whom he's speaking, they're not all his friends, including Jonathan. Very disappointed with his father. And so the text said that Saul eyed David from that day forward. It came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul. He prophesied in the midst of the house, and David played with his hands as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. What did Saul do? He threw it at David. Now David knows he's in trouble, doesn't he? He knows he's in trouble. Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul, look, Saul was the one fearful, wasn't he? Saul was afraid of him because the Lord was with whom? With David. With David and had departed Saul. Now, David, it says in verse 14, behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Now, that's a great statement about his character, isn't he? There are people who have a lot of talent and a lot of ability, but they don't always have wisdom, do they? It appears that at least at this particular time in his life, we can say that David was wise. He behaved himself in the right kind of way. David was wise. And so when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. You see, those in Saul's position tremble at those who are in control of themselves. All right? Now, I'll tell you somebody else who was always in control of himself, and that's Jonathan. And Jonathan is going to do what? Jonathan is going to try to bring some peace here. But now, let's notice, first of all, how that verse 16 says, all Israel and Judah loved David. There was something about his character that was just so very, very appealing, right? All of Israel just fell in love with him. Personable, good attitude, humble, strong and courageous, wise. He had all the characteristics, certainly, that God would say, if you've got to have a king, this is the one that I want. Now, Saul is going to give to David his eldest daughter. And he said, just be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. And he said, this is a setup, really. Because he wants David to fight his battles so that what will happen? Okay, so what he's going to do here is, instead of me looking like I'm out to get David, I'll just set him up, all right? I'll just set him up. Surely David would remember this particular instance when a king set him up to be killed, right? But evidently he didn't. Because one day, our beloved David would do the same thing, wouldn't he? He would set up a righteous man to be killed. Now here is David in this particular setting where Saul wants him dead. And so David said to Saul, who am I that all this honor should be bestowed upon me? Who am I? What is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be son-in-law to the king? He said, who am I that I should receive this? But it came to pass at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given unto Adriel. Michal, Saul's daughter, she loved David, and she told Saul how much she loved him, and that pleased him. And by the way, David would later slaughter the children of Adriel and Merab, and we'll get to that at a later time. But Saul's daughter Michal loves David. Now, again, Saul wants to use Michal as one, his daughter as one who can possibly set a snare for David. He said, I'll give him her, that she may be a snare to him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. And wherefore Saul said to David, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain. Now, think about that for a moment. He doesn't understand that Michal, she loves David. And so he's going to set her up to do what? Well, she'll send him out to battle. She'll do whatever the bidding is of her daddy. And so Saul's servants, when Saul commanded his servants, saying, Commune with David secretly, and say, Behold, the king hath delight in thee, and all his servants love thee. Now therefore be the king's son-in-law. Saul's servants spake those words in the ear of David. And David said, Seemeth it to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And the servants went and told Saul what he said. And Saul said, Thus shall you say to David, The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall with the hand of the Philistines. Now this got David's attention, because if he can go out and do this on behalf of the king and on behalf of Israel, he will do it. But what's Saul thinking? He'll never be able to do that. Does he? He does. He does. And so we'll pause right there in our study as we come to the conclusion of chapter 18. When the servants told David these words, it pleased David to be the king's son-in-law. David arose, went his men, they slew the Philistines, 200 of them, brought the foreskins back to the king. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, that his daughter loved him, and Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy. Look at this, continually. So now we see Saul is set to do something to David, but Jonathan's going to come to the rescue. And Jonathan is going to help protect his friend from his father. And so we will continue our study next week as we begin chapter 19.